And we've been here before. The same old monsters and the same old stat. I know what you're thinking. Someone's here to drag Dungeons & Dragons tropes again. That's not what I'm here for. Let's see what we can do with the toys in our toy box and use the aberration type of monster to determine how we can build better worlds and tell better stories with monsters. When we think of aberrations, we tend to think of the great beyond, the unthinkable, and the completely incomprehensible. The deepest of the sea, the darkest of the voids. And with these, the creatures that call them home. These creatures are in many ways very alien in most fantasy TTRPG settings. However, let's look a bit further into the fantasy of these creatures. Now, the dictionary defines aberration as a departure from what is normal, usual, or expected, typically one that is unwelcome. This fits fairly well with the types of monsters we tend to see. Most aberrations in one way or another do deviate from the normal bestial and monstrous expectations, whether it's floating without wings, one too many eyes, or tendrils, or any number of the other supernatural, often mental abilities. So then, what is the fantasy? What is the story that this word labeling these monsters is trying to convey? Well, I'm not trying to rewrite the cosmology itself, but it's clear that while plenty of these creatures are original, many of their aesthetics are inspired by Lovecraftian horror. H.P. Lovecraft is likely a familiar name to anyone who has gotten this deep into thinking about aberration. Who is he as a historical figure is not the most important to this thesis, but he's a writer who originated a lot of what we see as the common form of aesthetics and presence of many of the elder or old gods, the cosmic core. Many names like Azathoth or Cthulhu come directly from Lovecraft. Even creatures like Hastur derive their inspiration from the same source material. The fact of the matter is, H.P. Lovecraft set the groundwork for a great deal of the space horrors out running rampant in fiction. It is something present in video games, movies, music, even 2 kids shows come to mind. Justice League's episodes Terror from Beyond Part 1 and 2, and the real Ghostbusters episode Collect Call of Cthulhu. But unfortunately, my TTRPG friends, even we are not safe from the maddening influence. One of the most popular non-fantasy TTRPGs has to be Chaosium's Inc.'s Call of Cthulhu, where I have heard best described that if in D&D you were to be described as the main character of a fantasy action-adventure movie trying to slay a dragon, in Call of Cthulhu, you are the victims of a horror movie desperately trying to survive. Needless to say, there is a lot of media that takes direct inspiration from the Lovecraftian creation. If you want a more comprehensive list, I'll drop a link to a works influenced by Lovecraft source reference if the madness makes you hunger for more media. Well, now that we have the ground floor covered, let's keep building up with these monsters. What do we need from them? It is something that is often lost in the planning and referencing for session prep. Monsters have desires, as they are oftentimes living creatures with needs and purpose. However, they are characters in the story, whether we are talking about the BBEG of the whole campaign being an Elder Brain, or you're just planning on throwing an Intellect Devourer or a Nothic at your party. All these creatures serve a purpose, and with aberrations, that is more often than not going to be confusing and unsettling your player. That's the name of the game. If we take aberrations at their most diluted form, it is to confuse and unsettle. They're alien. Their wants, abilities to act and survive may never make sense to you or your party. However, if you were talking narrative structure, you could think of this sobering reminder to your party. There is a much, much larger world out there. There's always another strange opponent to do combat. Something to help remind the party and the players that not all creatures are going to act, want, and need as they are, and not everything can be handled in such a straightforward manner. Once you understand purpose that they hold for you, think about what they want or need. Any sort of aberration can serve a various purpose. They can have numerous motives, but I've always found when I can connect, relate, and associate to one to another that they help form a more cohesive image and tell a stronger joint narrative. As Keith Amon points out in his book, The Monsters Know What They're Doing, aberrations are monsters that come from somewhere other than the natural world that players inherit. And actually, I'd like to take a minute and further go through Keith's intro paragraph for aberrations, as it provides a few key points of insight that I'll be thinking about going forward. In 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, aberrations are monsters that come from somewhere other than the material world that the players inhabit, from other planes or even other universes. We can still presume that they've evolved, although the conditions they've evolved in may be very different from our own, and that they still behave in ways that further their own survival, no matter what alien thought process they may possess. When running aberrations, be they weird entities that dream themselves into existence, psionic invaders from the far realm, monstrous abomination, helter-skelter creatures of chaos, or ancient entities of unexplored depth, it's important to convey their alienness. Their more unusual features help with this, but even their ordinary attacks benefit from being depicted through a warped lens. Remember, Your player characters aren't people to them. They're animal or object. Maybe aberrations aren't attacking out of what they understand as malice. Maybe they're attacking for the same reason we'd smack a malfunctioning vending machine. For that, I'd also like to reference some stuff I've picked up through reading through Pathfinder 2nd Edition's Bestiary. Whether it's the Chul, the Brain Collector, or the Faceless Stalker, so many aberrations have such drive and purpose. It's usually left open-ended, because at the end of the day, I acknowledge that a great deal of TTRPG elements aren't given wholly defined answers because the GM is supposed to step in and tell their own story, put their own twist. However, my channel has always been wanting to help make this table space more approachable for creators who might still be fledglings in their nest, or experienced flyers who might want a new perspective on something. So let's talk the different elements about my world, how I've connected them, and some ideas I have about big aberration retheming and reimagining. Let us go on into an adventure through history, fallen divinity, the void beyond, and approaching apocalypse. Easy enough? Come on. I've mentioned a few times now, but I like kaiju. In my world, they're going to be called Daigo. They are primordial, powerful beings, colossal in size. They range from being as big of a house to being the whole mountain range. Gigantes roamed the world before even the gods themselves were created. The overlord of creation was witnessing the world as something came from the great beyond, the void. The stars that the overlord thought only he linked. The creature was larger than the other Gigantes. It stood tall, powerful wings, beating winds that could rend and uproot the oldest of trees. However, its size and its wings were not its most defining feature. Instead, it would be the hundreds, if not thousands, of scaled, serpent-like heads sprouting from the top of the creature. 8 large scaled heads, as thick as the oldest dragons, who were yet to even be born the first time, with growing and shedding heads falling throughout the lands, detaching and spreading across. This creature was a destroyer. The malevolence of this creature rained down upon the ground, the seas, and the sky. This creature was known as Tai Shin. The progenitor of all aberrations is Tai Shin. While I won't spend too much time detailing every little element of them, I'd like to advise on a few different elements of Tai Shin's mood board. Firstly, Typhon, with a splash of King Ghidorah, final sprinkling of Yamada no Orochi. I want a motivation to come from the void. I want something otherworldly, but for my own creative process, I've never much cared for just outright aliens out in the universe in my fantasy setting. So I offer you up a horror from space, bigger than imagination and more destructive than anyone can understand. Now, back to the world. The Overlord watched as the Gigantes defended their home world, and they did remarkably well in the initial fight. Tai Shin kept regenerating. As the creatures tore off heads, others would grow and take its place. The Overlord realized that the Gigantes would eventually lose in the long term. The Overlord didn't trust this creature. Thus, he created the first of the gods to aid the Gigantes and turn the tide. Decades of battles could finally be brought to a close. Tai Shin could be separated and spread throughout the world. The magic of the gods sealed it away, while the destructive power of the Gigantes was what was used to sever the body. Various parts of the body would be cast throughout the various oceans. With the threat of the world-ending destroyer taken care of, what happens now? The injured Gigantes slumbered to rest. The gods, they grew bored, merely waiting, so they created the first ever everlasting. However, the rest of that, it's just history. Now, you might be wondering, that whole beginning of society origin story, what in the world does that have to do with aberrations? And really, I'm glad you asked. I always feel that aberrations being on the world feels a bit forced. We want aliens and cool weird creatures for the sake of cool and weird. Yes, I'm familiar with some of the great old ones, and I understand that mind flayer colonies usually invade, conquer, and consume minds for the sake of food needs. But motivation for a 5-year plan, something that brings them and needs them to interact with, invest, and change the world in the long term, it's usually not there. Give them a world presence, and if aberrations are born from the body of Tai Shin, that puts a great origin on the world play. Now with that, let me explain for those that may not piece together, but I want Tai Shin to not just be a powerful Hydra, but the Hydra. I had a bit of fixation with Hydras ever since my buddies got me into EDH Magic, The Gathering, and, well, it's really all because of this guy. With my space Hydra having threatened this world, and being separated by the gods and Gigantes, would it stop regenerating? Perhaps its eternal wounds and separations were able to keep its true form from ever rejoining. That didn't stop the natural, powerful regeneration from birthing more heads to evolve, adapt, and find other creatures to consume and evolve and adapt. The deep-rooted psionic powers that burns in the roots of most aberrations can be reasoned from the creatures that are made of fallen god for all purposes, having nothing to share with its creations but the anguish and pain of its mind and will. gifted into it, giving it this awakened sense, this awakened and influential mind. We have the god, their current place in the world, and what's going to start creating aberrations. But what do we do? I touched earlier on in this video. Motivation is ground zero for memorable and impactful characters. A good fight with a nameless random encounter can be a good session, but it likely doesn't have staying power. Think on a scale of something that would keep factions of the powerful, legions of the abnormal, strange creatures busy for centuries, even millennia, to accomplish. What if they wanted to put Taishin back together? Now, my thoughts here lead to a very assemble the pieces of the Forbidden One type of aesthetic. Certainly an apocalyptic thought, don't you think? Many of the powerful Daiganths who fought in the world are now slumbering, dormant, inaccessible. The gods are around, and some are dead, and some are new. What changes this? This world's creation races, the everlasting. What role these creatures play in the second round of combat against Taishin? Now, what would they need to do? Well, getting all the pieces of Taishin together, this would result in the need to relocate powerful, colossal pieces of a monster that's bigger than the size of a mountain. Perhaps they need to try teleportation? Perhaps they organize massive slavery of giants and dragons to use their larger sizes in order to assemble physical labor force. Another element to consider would be possibly think about the regeneration factor. Be sure that they fuse the right way. This could end up with some body horror transformation of Taishin, or perhaps a Frankenstein Taishin, using the pieces of slain Daiganths in order to make up for the parts that couldn't be relocated in time. Let me pose you another plot. Perhaps there's a need for a mass of souls and flesh to kickstart Taishin's life back with enough energy to combine its full body back to its true form. Perhaps that's why the Aberrations need to invade the creation race's society, to enslave and enthrall generation, because they're organizing a great sacrificial magic, the death of thousands of souls. Yes, I finished watching Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood about a month ago. Why do you ask? Intense labor, missing giant creatures, enslaved Daiganths, souls to be sacrificed, an apocalyptic threat looming in the near future. That give you enough story to work with? Well, don't worry, because giant monsters aren't your cup of tea. I have a few other inspired variants I could touch on towards the end of this video. With that, we've touched on a god of aberration, their current state, point of origin, motivation. Let's talk on a few pieces that make up aberrations. The ones you'll actually fight, the ones you'll actually use. If you really like this video, you can let me know. I'm more than happy to put even more aberrations into this pool, or perhaps look at some of the other types of monsters out there and do a similar thing with them. First up, let's talk about the next rank below Taishin when speaking on general faction role, the Mind. These, for all purposes, are your Elder Brain. Whenever Taishin began to rot and decay, laying dormant, just enough of it began to regenerate and fall off out of the original heads to begin to form what are known as Mind Forges. Think of them as greater Mysovaurs and Corazon. They roam the world striving for a higher calling. They understand their purpose to their creator. They know they need to become more powerful. They need to seek out everlastings, dragons, sphinxes, vampires, treants, celestials, fiends, or if you have any other creatures you think might make epic Mind Forges, let me know in the comments. One thing I want you to all realize is that there's nothing wrong with reskinning or repurposing an aesthetic, stat block, or anything else. It's no less original and no less impactful because they were derived from your inspiration. Create what you love and create from what you love. Over the life of a Mind Forge, they might body hop, slowly growing to higher and higher in level and influence until they're able to attain the form of an everlast. Perhaps it'd make an interesting NPC for your party to have to run into, a Mind Forge in process, or perhaps one of your PCs wants to take on that unique character backstory and be a Mind Forge. For these guys, I imagine them having a bit more of a Star the Conqueror type of body style, and not causing their host bodies to go through full Ceremorphosis. They'd have the ability to mind control, hop from body to body, until they can get to an everlasting. Once they attach to said everlasting and successfully mentally dominate it, they would overtake it, making a final form of this hybrid creature. Next are the Arkshin, or you might know them as Aboleth. Heads that were growing at the start when Taishin was defeated grew off, separating themselves. Many of them are as old as the first gods. Similar to the Sphinxes of the world, they largely hide away and guard great vaults of Taishin's faction. Some of the few, the most powerful, have begun overseeing the infiltration of cities to sacrifice for Taishin, places too valuable or too risky to send a Mysovaur faction in to infest and overtake. These would be lone agents moving through the sewers and working their charms with their psionic abilities to deal and charm their way of having a network of influential and dangerous individuals to begin a proper mass sacrifice. We'll quickly look at the Mysovaurs. These are the closest comparison points you have to original Mind Flayers. I go much more in depth in my Mind Flayers Reimagined video, so I won't dwell too much on the detail. Check out the video, let me know what you think. make. As I said, these creatures seek, destroy, and consume the minds and positions of those they overtake. Now let's touch on their counterpart. The whole reason this video was originally going to be made, but got pushed back as I ended up having far too many things to say. If the Mice of Ours are the evil and selfish versions of the Mind Flayer, what's the other side of the coin? Yes, let me properly introduce you to the Corazon, and it wouldn't be a Magpie video without the tried and true Magpie's world building method. We'll take it from the top and you'll be the absolute masters of the Corazon by the end of it. M is for military. They avoid matters of war. Much like the Jedi in the Clone Wars series, they are seen as useful and sometimes dangerous tools. They would be easily pressured into playing a more active role in the invasion of the Mice of Our. They would have the memories and knowledge of strategy and the capacity to gain and grow quickly through the process for more information. A is for art. Corazons spend a great deal of time studying and interpreting art. It isn't often they create it themselves, but they process and intake memories and thought to try and understand the expressions of the creation races. In their society, creating art is often seen as taboo, since it is questioned if their expressions and creations are their own or just the sum of their memory. G is for geography. Where Mice of Ours are destructive and corrosive to the kingdoms they invade and conquer, Corazons try to improve and enrich. They're able to act as little mental health resources and consultants for moral and ethical decisions, able to debate philosophy, to enrich and educate. This is often a common pastime, profession for a Corazon. P is for politics. They would largely absolve themselves from partaking. They would find themselves in positions of the masters of the kingdom. See my first video ever on world building for more on that. Or merely offer their knowledge whenever desired. An interesting transformation that can happen with Corazon loses their discipline, a kindred heart for appreciation of knowledge, be haunted by the temptation for knowledge, and undergo a secondary Ceremorphosis, where they would transform into a bastardized Mice of Our, an outcast, perhaps a Mice of Our errant, or a Hive Ronin. I is for intelligence. This is where the Corazon would want to be involved, not to push an agenda most of the time, but to merely consume and indulge in the mental gymnastics, the mind chess game that various factions might play. They would be hungry and self-interested in wanting to move and consume knowledge. E is for economy. Once again, for a Corazon's, knowledge is currency. I think I want memories and knowledge to be what the Mice of Our and Corazon feast on for actual sustenance. For the Mice of Our, they leave husks behind, empty drones that can be enslaved and enthralled. For the Corazon, they only feast when it's gifted. It is trusted and from a friend. Thus it is forbidden for a Corazon to feast to the point of death, unless the direct wish is given by the individual. They are slower to consume, thus a bit more malnourished in body and appearance. They often act as historians or representatives of certain large portions of society when available. S is for spiritual. Corazon are obviously the black sheep of the general group of Aberrations. They are often questioned for their sincerity or guessed to be double agents, but that's merely because no one else was there at their first birth. Way back when the gods and Digants had defeated Taishin, they wanted to outright destroy Taishin, but there were two that bickered, beings by the name of Wrath and Mercy. One of them wanted them dead. The other thought that there'd been enough death and destruction. The decision to not outright destroy them ended up winning out, and the first offspring born wondered, did this mean that there was a chance for peace, for coexistence? From this one mind forge, the rest of the Corazon were born, and that creature's story, whether it's alive or dead, this day, is all for you to decide, or for your players to figure out. Now I want to touch on a quick add-on. I didn't touch much on my Magpie's mood board with the Mice of Our, but that's because I kind of talked a bit more through it. However, if you guys remember, the Mice of Our are largely based on more Western termites, the kinds that'll eat your house and destroy anything and everything to consume. Well, the Corazon I'd like to point in a different direction. African termites. They're through and through a blessing to farmers. They hyper-enrich the ground to help plants grow, so their large complex towers are allowed to grow undisturbed all the way up to the sky. In addition, as mentioned, I draw a lot of inspiration from Star Wars' Jedi. While I find myself these days being a bit more of a filthy casual of the fandom, I've always loved the complex political turmoil the Jedis got themselves into, especially during the Clone Wars. Taking a faction that was never meant to lead a war and making them generals, the possible moral and ethical corruption, the perception of opposing views on the same overarching force of the universe. It's all stuff that's just ripe for inspiration. Up next, of course, comes the Beholder, or as I would like him to be known, the Tyrant. You like that, don't you? I came up with it all on my own. Whenever a Mice of Our or Corazon consumes too much knowledge, they might have an overwhelming amount of pain. They undergo a ritual that takes the amalgamation of those thoughts, festering them and compressing them, all of the unnecessary memories, the extra memories, into a creature, the Tyrant. They can also be born from old mice of ours or Corazon that die and are left to naturally decompose, the psionic energies warping reality and creating these creatures. In war, I imagine they are often forced out of powerful mice of ours in order to create these depth charges or landmines to just disrupt and disorient the enemy factions. I imagine since they are creatures that are nothing but a mire of useless memories and thoughts, they can largely retain that erratic, insane behavior, but I'd say get rid of that every other creature is a lesser existence. It's sort of a boring take that paints a very not team player in getting Taishin's body back together. Now, there are countless other aberrations, Chuls, Flumps, Nothics, Dark Tentacles, and so many more. Some of them I don't even want to try and pronounce on record, since if I say their names out loud, and I'm well aware they all have official pronunciations, I'll just kind of embarrass myself. I'm sure you're fuming with thoughts and actions. You want to go create whole campaigns worth of content of aberrations in new light, aren't you? Well, let me finish the last few bits of business before I send you on your way. If giant monsters aren't your thing, perhaps you can take inspiration in a different light. It comes to mind that I might think of Brainiac as a good inspiration, and technically, and sometimes he is an elder god, some eldritch horror of knowledge in the deep space, but that could give you the distant goal of a hunger for knowledge. Maybe a dead, forgotten god of knowledge has the hunger to take back his domain by force, consuming all of the knowledge of the world. Or perhaps another suggestion might be the hybrids from Ben 10 Alien Force. I don't know if this dates me in any form or fashion, but I've always thought they had a cool design, and the genetic superiority being their downfall could also be fun to explore. A once superpower of the cosmos frantically searching the universe for genetic compatibility or a way to keep their race pure, weaponizing the lesser species of the aberrations in order to target and control the learning and technology of a world to improve their own state back home. Those are two other suggestions that I almost thought of a way of exploring even within Taishin's legacy, and I might still. That's been the hardest part of this whole video, is as I've been writing, fleshing this out, much like a Hydra, I've continued to see more and more and more grow back. I've thought of other aberrations I want to use and manipulate. I've thought of other elder gods known as the Children of Shin. It is a deep enough well that I'm excited to do all of this for any other type of monster or faction you guys may want to see. What I want you guys to take from this video is not only inspiration, but ultimately the theory of having monsters. As the writer or the GM of the story, you need monsters to serve a purpose. Oftentimes, this is as an antagonist, but it can be done in a way that challenges the characters in unique and dynamic ways. As well as remember that just as the monsters can fight tactfully and know what they're doing, the monsters also know what they want. Why are they here? What are they willing to pay their life to accomplish? This is what makes monsters stand the test of time. With that adventure, I hope your roads stay safe and your campfire burns bright, as you never know what true horrors lurk in the darkness. Thanks, and thanks again. Magpie responsibly.